Marcus Williams had worked 10 years at the company, 10 years of silence, 10 years of being invisible. But the morning he finally spoke up in a meeting, pitching the idea he'd nurtured for months, the room froze. Seconds later, his manager repeated Marcus's exact words, and the table erupted in applause. Everyone clapped, everyone praised, but not for Marcus. And in that moment, Marcus realized the truth that would change everything. What happened next left the entire office stunned. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The marble floors of Harvard's grand halls gleamed under fluorescent lights. Students rushed between classes, clutching laptops and coffee cups. Professors walked with the quiet authority of people who believed their words could move nations. And administrators clicked past in heels polished sharp as glass. In that world of prestige and intellect, Isaiah Carter did not exist. At least, not in the way others did. Every morning at 5 a.m., Isaiah arrived before the sun had the courage to rise. He wore the same faded navy work shirt, a ring of keys hanging heavy from his belt, and a mop bucket that squeaked slightly with every push. He kept his eyes low, his steps steady, and his voice silent. To most, he was not a man with a history or with a mind of his own. He was simply the janitor. When professors breezed past him, their conversations about funding and research grants never paused. When students rushed by, their laughter and gossip swelled, as though he were a piece of furniture in the hall. To them, Isaiah wasn't invisible because they couldn't see him. He was invisible because they chose not to. But Isaiah carried a secret. As he cleaned offices late into the night, when the campus finally exhaled into silence, Isaiah whispered. Words, sentences, fragments of poetry, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, French, Spanish, Italian, Mandarin, Russian, Swahili. His tongue shifted across 9 languages, as smoothly as the mop glided across the floor. He spoke them not for an audience, but for survival. For himself. It had begun years earlier, as a boy in Baton Rouge. His grandmother, Marie, taught him Creole in their kitchen, telling him that language was more than sound. It was memory. It was survival. Later, when Isaiah found himself in schools where teachers wrote him off as a troublemaker or slow, languages became his secret rebellion. Every word he mastered was proof that he was not what they said he was. Now at Harvard, each language whispered in the dark halls was his quiet reminder that his mind was not bound by the mop in his hands. He was more, though no one cared to know it. One afternoon, while Isaiah polished the brass door handles of the linguistics department, a group of graduate students entered, their voices cutting sharp through the hallway. Did you see the email from Whitmore? One laughed. He says anyone who doesn't understand Old English by now should reconsider their career. Can you imagine being that stupid? The others snickered. Isaiah kept his head down, focusing on the rhythmic motion of the cloth in his hand. Honestly, another said, tossing her hair back. They should be grateful they even got in here. Some people are lucky they're not scrubbing floors for a living. Their laughter echoed as they walked away, leaving Isaiah alone in the hallway, his hand frozen on the brass handle. The irony twisted in his chest. If only they knew. He finished the door, placed his rag back in his cart, and wheeled away in silence. But that night, while scrubbing the long glass panels of the library, the words spilled out of him with unusual force. Le mot du pouvoir, he murmured in French. Words have power. Then in Russian, his voice firmer. No one takes that from me. The vast library swallowed his words, bouncing them back in whispers, as though the walls themselves conspired to keep his secret. At home, in his small rented apartment on the edge of Cambridge, Isaiah's life looked as unassuming as his work uniform. His bookshelves, however, told another story. Dictionaries, phrase books, tattered novels in foreign languages. He had collected them like treasures over the years, most bought secondhand for a few dollars, some pulled from free piles left on curbs. Isaiah often sat at his kitchen table late into the night, books spread before him, repeating phrases under his breath until the words stuck to him like armor. He never dreamed of being a professor, never imagined Harvard's halls would celebrate him. He studied because language was the only place no one could tell him no. And yet each morning he put on his faded shirt and carried his mop into halls where people with doctorates passed him like a shadow. There were small moments, flickers of humanity though rare. Once, a freshman named Claire had smiled at him as he held open a door. "Thank you, sir," she'd said, her tone genuine. It startled him so much that he almost forgot to respond. Another time a security guard nodded at him, muttering, "Hard work, brother," before disappearing down the hall. But those gestures were pebbles against a mountain. The daily truth was sharper. A professor tossing a coffee cup into his cart, without a glance. A secretary shooing him away when he paused too long outside her office. Students walking by mid-argument, using the word janitor as shorthand for failure. Isaiah swallowed it all, word by word, until night came again, and the whispers returned. It was on a Thursday evening in early spring, long after most staff had gone home, that the moment came. Isaiah was in the faculty corridor, polishing the floor with his slow, steady rhythm, when he felt the pull to speak. The day had been harder than usual. He'd overheard a professor describe him as that mute man with the mop, and the insult sat heavy in his chest. He began in Italian, the language rolling smooth off his tongue. "Le parole sono finestre," he whispered. "Words are windows." Then in Mandarin, "If you listen, the world opens." His mop swayed in time with the cadence of his speech, like a dance no one else could see. But someone did. At the far end of the corridor, footsteps slowed. A tall man in a gray blazer paused, his brow furrowed. Professor Daniel Whitmore, head of the linguistics department, tilted his head slightly, listening. Isaiah didn't notice him at first. He had shifted into French, his voice low but steady. To be heard is to exist. The professor's eyes narrowed. The janitor's accent, precise, fluid, undeniably authentic. He took a step closer, his shoes clicking sharply against the polished floor. Isaiah froze. He had heard the footsteps too late. His mop halted mid-swipe. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned. Whitmore's eyes were fixed on him, unblinking, calculating. For the first time in years, Isaiah's secret was no longer his own. One night, a professor passing by finally heard him and stopped in his tracks. One choice, one heartbeat. That's all it takes to change everything. What would you have done? Comment your answer and subscribe for more powerful stories of survival and courage. The sound of Professor Whitmore's shoes echoed down the hall, each step deliberate, carrying the weight of authority. Isaiah still held his mop frozen mid-swipe, his breath caught somewhere between fear and defiance. For years he had spoken freely only to walls, books, and empty air. Now those words had betrayed him, pulled into the orbit of someone who wasn't supposed to hear them. Whitmore didn't speak at first. He simply stared, his sharp gray eyes narrowing as though he were studying a specimen under glass. The silence stretched, heavy enough to suffocate. Finally, the professor's voice cut the air. "You speak French," he said flatly, his tone more accusation than observation. Isaiah shifted his weight, his palms clammy against the wooden handle of the mop. "A little," he replied quietly, though the words he had just spoken moments before carried the elegance of a Parisian poet. Whitmore tilted his head, almost smirking. "A little?" That sounded more than a little. Isaiah dropped his gaze back to the mop. He'd been in this position before, the moment where acknowledging his knowledge only invited disbelief or mockery. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was safer. But Whitmore was not moving. His presence demanded something. The professor gave a short, humorless laugh. "Imagine that. The janitor knows French." He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the corridor. Isaiah exhaled slowly, gripping the mop tighter. He had been noticed, yes, but not seen. Not really. What Whitmore heard was not beauty, not intellect, not years of hard work. It was an oddity, a curiosity, something to marvel at and dismiss in the same breath. He resumed his cleaning, but his mind spun backward through time, pulled to the moments that had shaped him. Isaiah's earliest memories were filled with voices. His grandmother Marie humming Creole lullabies, in a tiny kitchen that always smelled of red beans and rice. She had been a housekeeper herself, her back bent from decades of labor, yet her words carried a richness that no school textbook ever offered. "Isaiah," she would whisper, lifting his chin when he was small enough to sit on her lap. "Don't you ever let nobody tell you your tongue ain't gold. Creole is ours. It's history, baby. Every word carries the blood of people who refuse to disappear." She taught him patiently, repeating phrases until he could recite them without hesitation. When neighbors came over, she made him translate their chatter, delighting when he strung together sentences smoother than his age suggested. At school, however, language became both shield and target. Teachers dismissed his curiosity as arrogance. When he corrected a pronunciation, They accused him of being disruptive. When he wrote essays laced with French expressions, they marked him down for being unclear. By middle school, classmates sneered when he spoke differently. "You trying to be smart, janitor boy?" one boy jeered once, shoving Isaiah's books to the ground. The nickname stuck, long before it was reality. Every insult carried the weight of prophecy, that he would never belong, never rise, never be more than a man cleaning up after others. It was then that Isaiah began chasing languages more furiously. If the world decided he was nothing, he would at least know within himself that he carried something extraordinary. He devoured Spanish from the radio, Italian from tattered library books, and later Mandarin from a neighbor who ran a corner store. Language after language stitched itself into his bones, each one proof that he was not who they thought. Still, outside those whispers, the world refused to see. By the time Isaiah found work at Harvard, survival had trained him to keep his brilliance hidden. Students saw only a man who emptied trash cans, professors saw only the uniform, and administrators saw only someone whose name they barely remembered. When he polished the marble floors, they walked over them without pause. When he spoke, they assumed he was mumbling. No one imagined his silence contained 9 tongues, 9 worlds, 9 bridges across cultures.
And that was the cruelest part.
It wasn't that people didn't know. It was that they didn't care. His story, his labor, his gift, all erased by the lazy comfort of assumptions. That night, after Whitmore left him standing in the corridor, Isaiah returned home restless. His small apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt suffocating. He sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by open books in Spanish, French, Mandarin, and Swahili. His lips moved as he read passages aloud, as if reminding himself who he truly was. "Njiafila," he whispered in Zulu. "I am alive." He repeated it, again and again, until the words became a shield against the memory of Whitmore's smirk. Days passed, but something had shifted. Whitmore had heard him, and though he'd walked away, Isaiah could feel the weight of the professor's curiosity lingering like a shadow. Each time Isaiah pushed his cart down the halls, he felt eyes on him, professors glancing longer than before, whispers swelling behind half-closed doors. It was the kind of attention Isaiah had spent years avoiding, and deep down he feared where it might lead. Because attention, for men like him, rarely meant opportunity. It meant exposure. It meant ridicule. It meant another chance for the world to remind him of where it thought he belonged. The turning point came in the most ordinary moment. It was late morning, and Isaiah was mopping the floor outside a seminar room. Inside, students were gathered for a lecture. He could hear Whitmore's voice carrying through the open door, his tone commanding, his words sharp. "Language," Whitmore said, "is the foundation of civilization. Without it, culture collapses, but mastery is rare, reserved for those willing to dedicate their lives to it." Isaiah kept his head down, focusing on the mop, but the words pricked at him. Dedicate their lives to it. Had he not? Every free moment, every late night, every dollar scraped together for a second-hand book, and still, because he wore a uniform, because his skin was black, because he held a mop instead of a lecture pointer, he was invisible. Whitmore's lecture continued, now in French, his accent stiff and awkward. Students scribbled notes, some impressed, others confused. And then through the open door, Whitmore's gaze landed on Isaiah. Their eyes locked, brief but undeniable. Something flickered across the professor's face. Challenge, maybe even mischief. He turned back to his class. "Of course," Whitmore said loudly, gesturing toward the hallway. "Not everyone who claims to know a language truly understands it. Some parlor tricks sound impressive, until tested." A ripple of laughter spread among the students. Isaiah felt his throat tighten. He knew, without a doubt, Whitmore meant him. The memory of that smirk in the hallway was written all over the professor's words. Isaiah gripped his mop, steadying his breath, trying to remain invisible once more. But Whitmore wasn't finished. The professor's voice rose, commanding the room. "Perhaps we should test this idea right now. After all, truth reveals itself under pressure." Heads turned toward the doorway. Students craned their necks, eyes falling on the janitor in the hallway. Isaiah froze under their stares. Whitmore took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. "Isaiah," he called, his voice carrying into the hall, "would you care to demonstrate your French for the class?" The room erupted in whispers, half disbelief, half amusement. "The janitor? Speak French." Isaiah's heart pounded, his palms slick against the mop handle. For years he had been invisible. Now, with one sentence, Whitmore had dragged him into the spotlight he never asked for. And deep down, Isaiah knew this was not an invitation. This was a test, one designed for him to fail. The professor who overheard him decided to test Isaiah publicly in front of others. Being dismissed is its own kind of violence. What would you have done in Isaiah's place? Comment below, and if this story moved you, like and subscribe to keep these voices alive. The room fell into an uneasy hush as all eyes turned toward the janitor standing in the doorway. Isaiah Carter felt the weight of dozens of stares press against him, pinning him in place like a specimen displayed under glass. He hadn't asked to be here, hadn't volunteered to step into this world. Yet Professor Daniel Whitmore had pulled him into it with a single sentence that echoed in his chest like a gavel striking wood. Would you care to demonstrate your French for the class? The professor's voice was smooth, calculated, and dripping with challenge. He leaned casually against his desk, arms crossed, the faintest smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. To the students, it might have seemed like an invitation. To Isaiah, it felt like a trap. Whispers broke out among the students.
Wait, he speaks French?
Is this a joke? He's the janitor. The words stung, but Isaiah had heard worse his entire life. What shook him more was the silence in his own chest, the part of him that for years had whispered in private, now uncertain under this sudden glare of attention. Whitmore straightened, his eyes sharp as glass. In flawless French, he posed the question. Pouvez-vous nous dire, Monsieur Carter, ce que la langue signifie pour vous? Can you tell us, Mr. Carter, what language means to you? The room collectively leaned forward. The challenge was clear. If Isaiah stumbled, if his accent cracked, if his words wavered even slightly, Whitmore would have proven his point, that a janitor could never master what scholars had spent lifetimes studying. Isaiah inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had spoken French since childhood, taught by his grandmother in a kitchen filled with warmth and struggle. He had whispered it to himself in hallways where no one listened. And now, here, before those who doubted him, he allowed the words to rise. In French, his voice clear and steady, he answered, La langue est une maison. Chaque mot est une clé qui ouvre une nouvelle porte. Et pour ceux d'entre nous qu'on refuse d'écouter, c'est parfois la seule façon de survivre. Language is a house. Each word is a key that opens a new door. And for those of us who are refused a voice, it is sometimes the only way to survive. A ripple of surprise moved across the room. His accent was flawless, his phrasing elegant, his tone not that of a man fumbling through memorized lines, but of someone who carried the language deep in his bones. For a moment, silence reigned. One student dropped her pen. Another mouthed, "Wow." Whitmore's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected perfection. He had expected hesitation, the kind that could be laughed off, dismissed, written into a narrative where the janitor tried too hard and failed. Instead, Isaiah's words landed like an undeniable truth, heavy, resonant, irrefutable. Whitmore cleared his throat, regaining composure. Interesting, he said, switching now to Italian, his tone sharp. Allora, dimmi, qual è la differenza tra conoscere una lingua e possederla davvero?
Then tell me, what is the difference between knowing a language and truly possessing it?
Isaiah didn't pause. He responded in Italian, his words carrying the rhythm of poetry. Conoscere una lingua e ricordare le sue regole. Possederla e ricordare le sue ferite. To know a language is to remember its rules. To possess it is to remember its wounds. The class gasped. Not only was his Italian smooth, but his answer struck a chord, layered, profound, something more than academic. It carried the pain of history, of cultures scarred, of voices silenced yet surviving through words. A nervous laugh broke from one student, unsure whether to applaud or scoff. Another muttered, "Is he for real?" The disbelief spread, louder now, washing over Isaiah like a cold tide. Because even perfection wasn't enough. Even flawless fluency. Even depth of meaning. Still, the whispers in the room weren't admiration. They were doubt, suspicion, even discomfort. The idea that a janitor could speak this way seemed too impossible to accept. One student whispered, "Maybe he memorized those lines." Another, "Probably some internet trick. People fake accents all the time." Isaiah heard every word. He stood in the doorway, mop still in hand, feeling the room turn his gift into a performance to be picked apart. Whitmore adjusted his blazer, hiding his unease behind authority. He gave a thin smile, addressing the class. "You see, language can surprise us. Sometimes talent appears in unexpected places. His words sounded almost complimentary, but his eyes told another story, condescending, performative, as though Isaiah's brilliance were a novelty act to entertain his students. Isaiah's chest tightened. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't spoken to impress, hadn't revealed himself to be clapped for or mocked. He had spoken because words were his survival. Yet here, even in his perfection, he was not seen as equal, only as anomaly. The murmurs grew louder, laughter mixing with confusion. Instead of silence in awe, there was dismissal cloaked as curiosity. And as Isaiah gripped the mop tighter, he realized, to them, he would always be the janitor, who spoke too well. From the back of the room, a woman's voice cut through, soft but venomous. A faculty member, arms folded, muttered under her breath, though just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Well, isn't that cute?" The help-playing professor. The words slithered across the room, sharper than any test Whitmore could have thrown. Isaiah heard them, and for the first time in years, something inside him refused to stay silent. A faculty member muttered a racist remark under her breath, one that Isaiah couldn't ignore. Stories like this happen every day, though most never make the headlines. Share this video if you believe the world needs to see it, and subscribe for more stories that expose injustice. The room froze around the words. "Well, isn't that cute?" The help-playing professor. The remark had been whispered, almost careless, yet it struck Isaiah like a fist to the chest. It wasn't the first time he had heard words like that. They had chased him through childhood classrooms, echoed in workplaces, and lingered in the silence of passing strangers who looked at him and saw only what they wanted to see. But something about hearing it here, in this hallowed room of supposed intellect, in front of students who would inherit the world, cracked something inside him. For years he had bowed his head, swallowed the insults, carried his dignity quietly in books, and whispered words when no one was listening. But now, after standing in front of the class and proving himself in 2 languages, after giving answers that should have commanded respect, the dismissal burned deeper. This time, he couldn't let it pass. Isaiah straightened slowly, his fingers tightening on the mop handle. The murmurs in the room fell away as students turned their attention back toward him. For the first time, he raised his chin and allowed his voice to fill the space. Not in French, not in Italian, but in English, sharp and steady. "You think brilliance wears one color?" The words cut through the classroom like a blade. A hush fell. The faculty member who had whispered the insult shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her smirk faltering. Professor Whitmore froze where he stood, his eyes narrowing in warning. Isaiah took a step into the room, no longer standing in the doorway. "You think intelligence belongs only to those with titles, with offices, with skin that looks a certain way? You're wrong. I've spent my life being told I was invisible, that I should stay silent, but silence has never built anything. Language has." His voice grew stronger, almost resonant, as though each word carried years of unspoken weight. "I speak 9 languages. Not because a university handed them to me. Not because a professor guided me, but because when the world told me I was nothing, words told me I was still alive." A ripple of sound moved through the students, not laughter this time, but a stunned murmur. For the first time they weren't mocking, they were listening. One student, Claire, the same freshman who once thanked him sincerely for holding a door, raised her hand timidly. "That was incredible," she said softly, her eyes wide with awe. "You said words are wounds, that they carry history. Can you tell us more?" Isaiah paused, surprised. He had expected disbelief, maybe even more ridicule. But here was something different, genuine curiosity. He nodded slowly. "Every language carries scars," he said. "French carries the memory of colonization. Creole carries the memory of survival. English carries the weight of being both weapon and bridge. When you study words, you don't just study grammar. You study people, pain, resistance, joy. That's what it means to truly understand language." The classroom was silent. And then, from the back, a pair of hands began to clap. Tentative at first, almost nervous. A second set joined, then a third. Scattered applause grew, awkward and hesitant, but real. It wasn't a standing ovation. It wasn't thunderous. But for Isaiah, it was more than he had ever received in these halls. For the first time in years, the silence broke, and he was not invisible. But the applause did not fill every corner. Whitmore's expression remained unreadable, his jaw tight. The faculty member who had mocked Isaiah stared at her notebook, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. And above all, the tension in the air made it clear what had just happened was not going to be forgotten. Isaiah felt a flicker of validation, but it was fragile, almost dangerous. The applause wasn't only approval, it was rebellion, and rebellions rarely go unpunished. After class, students spilled into the hallway, their conversations buzzing. Did you hear him? 9 languages? Was he serious? He was better than Whitmore. Isaiah stood by his cart, silently packing away his cleaning supplies. He felt their eyes dart toward him, some with admiration, some with suspicion. A few even offered small nods of respect as they passed. But he knew how fleeting such gestures could be. Respect given in whispers was as fragile as silence itself. As the crowd thinned, Whitmore approached. His steps were deliberate, his hands folded behind his back like a man who owned the ground he walked on. "Well, Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, "you certainly surprised them." Isaiah met his eyes, steady. "Did I surprise you?" Whitmore gave a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. Surprise is not the same as respect. Be careful not to confuse the two. The warning hung in the air. It was not spoken with anger, but with authority, the kind that could close doors quietly, permanently. Isaiah nodded once, neither agreeing nor backing down. He pushed his cart away, leaving Whitmore watching him with an expression Isaiah could not quite read, part curiosity, part unease, part something darker. That night, Isaiah returned home carrying more weight than usual. His apartment was silent, a stack of books on his table waiting for him like old friends. He opened one, a Spanish anthology, but the words blurred before him. For the first time, the silence he had once loved felt heavy. It wasn't enough anymore to whisper to himself. Something had shifted. He had spoken out, broken the room's silence, and now the air around him hummed with consequences he could not yet see. The next morning, Isaiah walked into Harvard with his cart. The same uniform, the same mop, but everything felt different. Students glanced at him longer than usual. Some whispered when he passed. He wasn't invisible anymore, but visibility came with its own danger. Midday, as he mopped outside the administration wing, he overheard voices from inside a partially open door. Another voice. "Students are talking. Some are even praising him. We need to handle this quickly." Isaiah froze, his mop suspended in midair. They were talking about him. He backed away quietly, heart pounding. For once his gift had earned him more than silence, but it had also painted a target on his back. Later that afternoon, a summons arrived in the form of a crisp envelope, slipped under his cart. His name was typed neatly on the front, Isaiah Carter. Inside was a single line, "Dean Harrington requests your presence tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The words chilled him. Isaiah had broken his silence. He had reminded them that brilliance did not wear one skin color. He had tasted validation for the first time. But the halls of Harvard had long memories, and power rarely forgave disruption. But the university's dean saw the moment very differently. Behind every face dismissed as ordinary lies extraordinary potential. Share this if you believe in second chances, and like this video so more people see the truth. Isaiah arrived at the administration building the next morning, his uniform ironed sharper than usual, though his nerves betrayed him in the stiffness of his shoulders. The hall outside the dean's office smelled faintly of lemon polish and quiet judgment. He sat in a chair that seemed too small beneath portraits of stern-faced donors staring down at him from gilded frames. Each pair of painted eyes seemed to ask the same silent question, "What are you doing here?" At exactly 9 o'clock, the office door opened. A secretary, her lips pressed into a polite but distant smile, gestured him inside. Dean Harrington's office was cavernous, lined with mahogany bookshelves and walls that seemed to swallow sound. Harrington himself sat behind a massive desk, his silver hair perfectly combed, his suit tailored with surgical precision. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were sharp in the way of men who were accustomed to weighing people like figures on a ledger. "Mr. Carter," the dean said, folding his hands. "Please, sit." Isaiah lowered himself into the chair across the desk, the leather creaking under his weight. He kept his back straight, though his palms sweated against his knees. The dean's voice was calm, almost cordial. "You've attracted some attention." Isaiah said nothing. Harrington's tone sharpened. "I've heard reports that you disrupted Professor Whitmore's class, that you were invited to speak and responded in a way that, let's say, blurred professional boundaries." Isaiah swallowed, His voice, when it came, was steady. I was asked a question. I answered. Harrington raised a brow. Yes, and quite dramatically it seems. You must understand, this is an academic institution. Roles here are defined for a reason. Professors teach, students learn, staff provides support. It can be unsettling when those lines are crossed. Isaiah's chest tightened. So my answer was unsettling. The dean leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. Your presence in that classroom created a distraction. The students are already buzzing. Some are impressed, some are confused. But either way, you've become a topic of conversation. That is, not ideal. Not ideal. The phrase landed like a verdict, not a celebration of his ability, not an acknowledgement of his dignity, merely a problem to be managed. Harrington smoothed his tie. We value your service here, Mr. Carter. The campus cannot function without staff like you, but it's important that everyone remain in their appropriate place. Do you understand? Isaiah held his breath. He understood perfectly. He was being told that brilliance, when it came in his uniform and his skin, was dangerous. That survival meant silence. At Harvard, with all its prestige, had no room for a janitor who spoke 9 languages. But before he could respond, the dean's phone rang. Harrington answered sharply. His words clipped. Yes? I'll be right there. He hung up and rose smoothly. I have another meeting. Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter. Consider this a reminder. The conversation was over. Isaiah stood, nodded once, and left the office. His footsteps echoed down the marble hallway, heavier than the mop bucket he usually pushed. What Isaiah didn't know was that while he returned to his duties, another meeting was already forming in the shadows of Harvard's upper offices. In a wood-paneled conference room, a handful of professors and administrators gathered behind closed doors. Their voices were hushed but sharp, carrying the tension of people deciding the fate of someone who wasn't in the room. Professor Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his posture impeccable, his expression cool. Across from him sat Dr. Ellen Strauss, the faculty member who had whispered the cruel remark in class. The dean occupied the center, presiding like a judge. This cannot continue, Strauss began, her voice dripping with disdain. He made a spectacle in front of students. They're gossiping as if he's some kind of genius. He's not. He's a janitor. Whitmore spoke evenly, though his words were no less cutting. The issue is not his ability. Clearly the man speaks French and Italian. Perhaps more. The issue is perception. If students begin to see him as equal to faculty, it undermines our credibility. Equal? Strauss scoffed. Don't be absurd. Another administrator cleared his throat nervously. But the students are talking. Some of them are even, he hesitated, inspired. They're asking why someone with that skill is pushing a mop instead of teaching. The dean's jaw tightened. That question is precisely the problem. Harvard thrives on tradition, on hierarchy. If we blur those lines, we lose control. Silence settled for a moment, heavy with unspoken truths. Control. That was the real currency in the room. Not knowledge, not truth, but control. Whitmore finally leaned forward, his voice low but deliberate. Then we must contain this, before it grows. While administrators debated his future, Isaiah continued his work. Students passed him in the halls, some with glances sharper than before, others with hesitant nods of respect. He caught whispers, fragments of conversations that floated past him. That's the guy, right? They say he speaks 9 languages. No way. He's just the janitor. Just always just. At night, alone in the library, he was tasked with cleaning. Isaiah walked the aisles of books and let his fingers brush the spines. He knew more than anyone that knowledge here wasn't trapped in professors' mouths. It was on these shelves, waiting for anyone who dared to claim it. Yet he was barred from those classrooms not by ability, but by perception. He whispered to himself in Mandarin, in Russian, in Spanish, words that had carried him through loneliness, poverty, ridicule, words that no dean or professor could take from him. And yet, even with 9 languages in his chest, he felt the weight of Harvard's silence pressing down, trying to suffocate him back into invisibility. But invisibility has cracks, and sometimes the smallest whisper escapes through. One afternoon, as Isaiah was mopping near the main lobby, a group of students passed by. Among them was Claire, the freshman who had first shown him kindness. She was speaking animatedly to a friend. I'm telling you, she said, you should have heard him. He was brilliant. Better than half the professors I've had this year. Her friend frowned. Wait, you mean the janitor? Yes, Claire insisted. The janitor. Isaiah Carter. He's not who they think he is. The words caught the ear of another passerby. A young man carrying a notebook, his press badge tucked discreetly into his pocket. A freelance journalist, always hungry for stories the university would rather bury. He slowed, listening closely, his mind already turning. 9 languages. A janitor dismissed, mocked, silenced. A classroom moment that students couldn't stop talking about. His instincts flared. This wasn't just gossip. This was a story, and stories once told had power. A journalist got wind of the story. If you had the power to choose between protecting tradition or telling the truth, which would you choose? Comment now, and don't forget to share this story so more people can join the conversation. The journalist wasted no time. By the next morning, Isaiah's quiet existence had been cracked open, spilled into the digital world for strangers to consume. The article appeared on an independent news site, the kind students shared quickly when they sensed something authentic had slipped past the polished gatekeepers of mainstream outlets. The headline was blunt, simple, and impossible to ignore. Harvard janitor speaks 9 languages. The piece unfolded like a revelation. It described Isaiah's moment in Whitmore's class, his eloquent response in French and Italian, the stunned whispers that followed. It framed him not as a sideshow, but as a man overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated by an institution that prided itself on recognizing brilliance. The journalist's words cut sharply. In a school that charges over $50,000 a year to shape minds, the sharpest one in the room may have been holding a mop. Within hours, the article was shared across student forums, retweeted by activists, picked up by blogs hungry for stories that exposed hypocrisy. By the end of the day, Isaiah's name was trending locally. By the end of the week, it was national. In the world outside Harvard, Isaiah became an unlikely symbol. Comments flooded the article. This man is more impressive than half the professors I've met. Proof that talent exists everywhere, not just in ivory towers. Give him a teaching position already. Hashtag spread. Done invisible no more. Janitor genius. Harvard hypocrisy. Strangers who had never seen Isaiah's face demanded his recognition, his promotion, his story in the spotlight. But inside Harvard's walls, the reaction was far colder. In faculty lounges, conversations turned sharp. This is getting out of hand, one professor snapped, slamming a newspaper onto the table. Students are quoting him in essays now, citing him as if he were a scholar. Do you know how that makes us look? Another shook her head. It makes the university look careless. We've let staff confuse their roles with ours. Strauss, still fuming from the classroom moment, was blunt. He's undermining us. What's next? Will students demand janitors on faculty panels? This is absurd. Even those who weren't openly hostile expressed discomfort. Professor Whitmore himself, whose smirk had faltered the day Isaiah spoke, defended his position with veiled caution. He's a talented man, Whitmore admitted carefully over coffee with colleagues. But we must remember, he is not trained. He is not credentialed. If we allow this to grow, if we permit the narrative that anyone can rival us, what does that say about the years we've dedicated to study? The unspoken truth lingered. Isaiah's brilliance was not being measured for what it was. It was being measured for the threat it posed. Meanwhile, Isaiah's life had changed in ways he hadn't asked for. Students stopped him in hallways, their voices a mix of admiration and curiosity. You're the guy in the article, right? 9 languages? That's insane. Can you teach me some French? My roommate says you should start a language club. For the first time, they said his name, Isaiah, instead of the janitor. At first, he felt a flicker of pride. Years of invisibility replaced by recognition. But soon, the recognition became suffocating. Everywhere he went, eyes followed. Some were wide with respect, others narrowed with suspicion. In the cafeteria, conversations hushed when he walked by. In the library, students whispered behind stacks of books. The weight of attention bore down on him, until the mop felt heavier than ever. At night, Isaiah sat in his apartment, the glow of his phone screen illuminating his face. He scrolled through endless comments, articles, think pieces. Some celebrated him as proof that brilliance could not be bound by class or skin color. Others sneered, insisting the story was exaggerated, that a janitor could never truly master 9 languages. One comment caught his breath. Maybe he memorized a few phrases. People are gullible. Don't believe everything you read. Another. Next, they'll tell us the lunch lady has a PhD in physics. The cruelty stung. Not because it was new, but because it followed him even here, into the spotlight he never asked for. Isaiah set the phone down, pressing his palms against his eyes. The whispers hadn't vanished, they'd only grown louder, amplified now by thousands of strangers. Back on campus, the administration moved quickly. A private meeting convened in the dean's office. Harrington sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of composure, though his clipped tone betrayed irritation. "This article has put us in a difficult position," he began. "We cannot control the internet, but we can control what happens on this campus. Our priority is to protect Harvard's reputation." Whitmore spoke first, his voice deliberate. "We need to address the narrative. Right now, the story frames us as elitist. If we attack Mr. Carter directly, we risk confirming it." Strauss leaned forward sharply. "So we just let this fantasy spread? That a janitor rivals our expertise?" "No," Harrington said firmly. "We manage it, quietly. If he becomes a distraction, we reassign him, reduce his visibility, and if necessary," he trailed off, his expression cold, "we part ways." The room nodded grimly. Isaiah's name was no longer whispered with awe. It was whispered like a problem that needed solving. But outside those closed doors, the momentum kept growing. A student-led petition circulated online, demanding Isaiah be given a platform to teach. Knowledge belongs to everyone. The petition read, "If Harvard cannot recognize talent beyond titles, it betrays its mission." Hundreds of signatures poured in within hours. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards. "Learn from Isaiah Carter, the polyglot janitor." Students began asking if he would give unofficial lessons. Some professors quietly warned their advisees to stay away, fearing backlash if they supported him too openly. And then came the invitations. Local radio shows, a podcast, even a morning TV program, reaching out for an interview. Isaiah turned them all down. The attention was overwhelming. He had never sought fame, never wanted headlines. He wanted only the dignity of being seen as more than what his uniform implied. But the story was no longer his to control. Late one evening, Isaiah lingered in the empty corridor outside the linguistics department. He heard voices drifting from an open office. Whitmore's voice, low and urgent. "This cannot go on," Whitmore was saying. "Do you understand what happens if students start believing we overlooked him? It makes us look incompetent. It makes me look incompetent." Another professor murmured in agreement. "If this continues, our authority erodes. The dean must act." Isaiah froze, his chest tight. They weren't debating his talent. They were debating his existence, as though he were a stain to be scrubbed clean. For the first time, Isaiah realized. The article that celebrated him outside these walls had trapped him inside them. His visibility was no longer a shield. It was a target. The summons came 2 days later. Another envelope slipped quietly under his cart, his name typed neatly on the front. Inside, the same phrase as before, but with an edge sharper than he remembered. "Dean Harrington requests your presence immediately." Isaiah's stomach knotted as he folded the letter back into its envelope. The dean had already warned him once about knowing his place. But now, after the viral article, after the petitions, after the whispers turned into demands, this meeting would not be a reminder. It would be an ultimatum. He straightened his shirt, exhaled slowly, and began walking toward the administration building. The marble floors under his feet gleamed, polished by his own hands. And for the first time, Isaiah wondered if they were about to become the floors that swallowed him whole. The dean summoned Isaiah to his office with a chilling ultimatum. "Being praised in public but punished in private. What would you have done? Comment your thoughts below." Isaiah left Dean Harrington's office with his chest tight, his pulse drumming in his ears. The dean's words were still etched into his memory, calm on the surface, but heavy with menace. "You have two choices, Mr. Carter. Step back into silence, or face the consequences. Harvard will not be reshaped around a janitor." The words cut deeper than any dismissal he'd endured before. This wasn't the usual invisibility, the passive ignoring of his existence. This was deliberate. A warning. A cage. He walked back across the campus, mop handle rattling softly in the cart, the marble halls reflecting his blurred image. Students passed him, whispering again, their gazes darting away when he looked up. Fame and danger now followed him everywhere in equal measure. And then, as though the universe had conspired to twist the knife further, a familiar voice called from behind him. Isaiah. It was Professor Daniel Whitmore. Whitmore's face was as carefully composed as ever, but his tone carried something Isaiah hadn't heard before. Softness. "I'd like to talk," Whitmore said, adjusting his blazer as though preparing himself for negotiation. "Not here. Walk with me." Isaiah hesitated. Every instinct told him to avoid the professor who had humiliated him in front of a classroom, who had framed him as a spectacle. But Whitmore's eyes were steady, his invitation firm, and something in his voice suggested this was not a casual conversation. So Isaiah pushed his cart into a corner, wiped his hands on his shirt, and followed. They walked across the yard, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. Whitmore's stride was measured, his silence purposeful, until finally he spoke. "You've caused quite a stir," he said. "The article, the students, the petitions." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "I didn't write the article." "No," Whitmore said smoothly, "but you inspired it. And now, whether you like it or not, you are a symbol. Symbols are powerful, Isaiah. They're also dangerous." Isaiah stopped walking. "So which one am I? Powerful or dangerous?" Whitmore finally turned to face him. His smile was thin, almost rehearsed. "That depends on you." They sat on a bench near the old library, where tourists took photos of the ivy crawling up the brick walls. For a long moment, Whitmore studied Isaiah the way a chess player studies the board. Every move measured, every pause calculated. "I want to help you," Whitmore said finally. Isaiah blinked, skeptical. "Help me?" "Yes," Whitmore replied, leaning forward. "You're talented. Exceptionally so, but talent without guidance burns out quickly. The university, it doesn't know what to do with you. The dean, the faculty, they see you as a disruption. But if you had someone respected on your side, someone who could mentor you, perhaps this story could be shaped into something less threatening." Isaiah narrowed his eyes. "Less threatening for who? For me, or for Harvard?" Whitmore chuckled softly, as if to deflect. "For everyone. You don't understand how these institutions work, Isaiah. They don't bend easily. But with the right ally, you could have a place here beyond cleaning floors. Imagine lecturing, teaching, being recognized. I could open those doors for you." The words hung in the air, tantalizing yet heavy. For a moment, Isaiah almost allowed himself to picture it, standing at the front of a classroom, not as a curiosity but as a teacher, sharing his love of language openly. Students listening, not mocking, his grandmother's dream realized. But beneath Whitmore's polished tone, Isaiah felt the tug of unease. The same man who had tried to expose him now offered to shape his story. The same man who once smirked at his fluency now offered mentorship. It felt less like support and more like control. Still, Whitmore pressed on. "I'll be frank, Isaiah, without me this ends badly. The administration will silence you, one way or another. But with me, you have protection, opportunity, influence. You can become more than a janitor with a viral headline. You can become a scholar." Isaiah leaned back, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "And in return, what do you want from me?" Whitmore smiled faintly. "Nothing you don't already have. Just your cooperation, your trust. Allow me to guide your public image. You speak when I tell you to. You stay silent when I tell you to. In time, people will forget the controversy, and you'll have respect. Real respect." Isaiah's stomach turned. Respect, offered like a transaction. Trust, demanded by the same man who had doubted him. He stood slowly, his shadow stretching long across the grass. Respect isn't real if it has to be filtered through someone else. I don't need a handler, and I don't need to be told when I'm allowed to speak. Whitmore's smile faltered, just slightly, but he masked it with another polished expression. "Think carefully, Isaiah. Pride can be costly." Isaiah walked away, leaving Whitmore sitting alone on the bench, his gaze fixed sharply on Isaiah's back. That night, Isaiah couldn't sleep. Whitmore's words replayed in his head, both the promise and the threat. "I could open those doors for you. Without me, this ends badly." He sat at his kitchen table surrounded by his books, the spines worn and pages marked with years of devotion. He whispered phrases in Russian, in Spanish, in Mandarin, as though reminding himself that these languages belonged to him, not to Harvard, not to Whitmore. Still, doubt gnawed at him. Could Whitmore really help? Was rejecting him reckless, or was trusting him even more dangerous? The tension ate at him until sunrise. The following afternoon, Isaiah returned to the linguistics building to clean. The halls were quiet, but Whitmore's office door was ajar. On the desk inside, a computer screen glowed. Whitmore wasn't there. Isaiah hesitated at the threshold, his pulse quickening. He hadn't meant to snoop, but something, instinct, curiosity, maybe even survival, pulled him forward. From where he stood, he could see the subject lines of open emails. His eyes skimmed them, and his chest tightened. Containing the Carter situation. Optics of Faculty Association with Custodial Staff. Proposal, controlled platform for janitor polyglot. Isaiah stepped closer, his hands trembling. One email in particular was expanded on the screen. It was from Whitmore, sent to Dean Harrington, and several other faculty members. Isaiah Carter's sudden popularity presents both a challenge and an opportunity. Left unchecked, his story undermines faculty authority and diminishes our reputation. My recommendation: allow me to serve as his liaison. With proper control, we can redirect his narrative to reflect positively on the university. Without intervention, this situation risks spiraling into chaos. We cannot allow a janitor to dictate the terms of Harvard's intellectual standing. Isaiah's breath caught. The words blurred before his eyes. Whitmore hadn't wanted to mentor him. He wanted to manage him, to turn his life into a tool, to ensure that no matter how loudly Isaiah spoke, the message would always pass through someone else's filter. He staggered back from the desk, his heart pounding, the realization crashing over him like cold water. The ally he had been offered was no ally at all. Isaiah discovered Whitmore's private emails, and what they revealed shook him. If this story made you think about workers who are ignored every day, don't let it stop here. Share this video to amplify their voices, and subscribe to be part of this movement for change. Isaiah stood frozen in Whitmore's office, the glow of the computer screen illuminating the words that cut deeper than any insult, whispered in a hallway. His eyes scanned the lines again, as if reading them a second time might somehow make them less cruel, less deliberate. Isaiah Carter is nothing more than a circus trick, a novelty that has gotten out of hand. His role as janitor must remain clear. Granting him credibility undermines the institution. Immediate action is needed to contain the fallout. I strongly recommend revoking his campus access to non-staff areas before this spectacle escalates further. His stomach churned, his hands tightening against his thighs. He read the words again. Circus trick. The phrase felt like chains, a reminder that no matter how eloquently he spoke, how fluently he commanded 9 languages, the institution around him saw only entertainment, not intellect. The emails went on, each sentence another knife. His moment in class was accidental, and his abilities, while unusual, are not scholarly. They do not constitute expertise. We risk damaging Harvard's reputation if we allow the narrative of a janitor genius to continue unchecked. Contain this now. Whitmore had signed it with his usual flourish. The same professor who had smiled at him on the bench, who had spoken of mentorship and opportunity, who had dangled the possibility of recognition like a lifeline. Isaiah's throat tightened. The lifeline had been nothing more than a noose. He staggered back from the desk, nearly tripping over a chair. The office felt suffocating, the walls closing in, lined with shelves of books that Whitmore used to justify his authority. Books Isaiah had read too, whispered to himself in late nights. Words that belonged to him as much as they belonged to the man who mocked him. He left the office quietly, his footsteps soft against the polished floor. His body moved on instinct, but his mind screamed. Whitmore hadn't simply doubted him. He hadn't simply feared him. He had reduced him to nothing more than spectacle. A trick, a distraction, an inconvenience to be stripped away. By the time Isaiah reached the janitor's closet, his chest heaved with the weight of betrayal. He sank onto the wooden bench, burying his face in his hands. For years he had accepted invisibility. He had swallowed insults, endured silence, allowed himself to exist on the periphery. But this was different. This was calculated. A man who smiled at him had sharpened knives behind his back. And yet, what could Isaiah do? He was one man, without power, without title, without influence. Harvard's elite could erase him with a signature. The dean could dismiss him with a line of policy. Whitmore could bury him under academic jargon and polished rhetoric. His whispers, his languages, his brilliance, none of it was armor against the machinery of power. That night, Isaiah sat in his apartment surrounded by his books, but the sight of them brought no comfort. His grandmother's Creole dictionary, his tattered Spanish grammar, his Mandarin phrasebook, his well-worn Italian anthology. They felt like relics of a dream that had no place in this world. He picked up the French poetry collection he had carried for years, flipping to a passage he knew by heart. The words blurred through his tears, but he recited them anyway, his voice breaking. Les mots sont tout ce que j'ai. Words are all I have. He repeated it, again and again, the phrase collapsing into silence until only the hum of the refrigerator filled the room. The following days were heavier than before. Students still whispered his name, in hallways, some with admiration, others with disbelief, but Isaiah felt none of the flicker of validation he once had. Every glance now seemed suspicious, every word tinged with doubt. Strauss passed him once in the lobby, and smirked openly. Back to mopping floors, I see. Fame doesn't last long, does it? Isaiah kept walking, his grip on the mop handle so tight his knuckles whitened. Even Claire, the freshman who had once defended him, seemed hesitant now. She approached him gently after class one evening, her voice cautious. I don't know what's happening with the professors, Isaiah, but I want you to know some of us still believe in you. Isaiah managed a small nod, though his chest ached. Believe in me. The words felt both kind and cruel, because belief from students could not protect him from faculty emails that stripped him of dignity. The betrayal gnawed at him until it seeped into every corner of his day. He avoided Whitmore, avoided classrooms, avoided any place where the spotlight might fall again. He returned to silence, to invisibility, to the safety of blending into the background. But invisibility no longer felt like protection. It felt like surrender. Then, one rainy afternoon, as he wheeled his cart through the administrative building, a secretary stopped him. She was young, flustered, clutching an envelope, as if unsure whether she should even be holding it. Mr. Carter? She asked. Isaiah looked up, wary. She handed him the envelope. This came for you. It's unusual. Isaiah frowned, taking the letter. The paper was heavier than the campus memos he was used to. His name was printed neatly across the front, but the seal on the back was embossed. Unfamiliar foreign. He tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a formal letter, printed on crisp letterhead, the words written with precision. Mr. Isaiah Carter, it is with great honor that we invite you to speak at the International Conference on Linguistics and Cultural Bridges, held this year in Geneva, Switzerland. Your extraordinary command of 9 languages and your unique perspective on the intersection of language, class, and race has reached our attention. We believe your voice is not only relevant but necessary in the global conversation on the power of language. Travel, lodging, and accommodations will be provided. We eagerly await your response. Isaiah stared at the letter, his hands shaking. Geneva, an international conference, an invitation not to mop the floors of a classroom, but to stand at the front of one, to be heard, to be recognized, to be valued. His breath caught. This was not Harvard's doing. This was not Whitmore's manipulation. This was the world outside, reaching for him, seeing him not as a janitor, not as a spectacle, but as a voice worth hearing. And yet, beneath the awe, fear stirred, because he knew what Harvard would think of this. He knew how the dean would respond. He knew what Whitmore would whisper in his polished tones. But for the first time, the choice was not theirs to make. It was his. A shocking invitation arrived. Isaiah was asked to speak at an international conference. One choice. One heartbeat. That's all it takes to change everything. What would you have done? Comment below. The letter weighed heavy in Isaiah's pocket in the days that followed. Every time he unfolded it, the words shimmered like a dream too fragile to touch. Geneva. International Conference on Linguistics. A place where the world's most respected scholars gathered. A place where his voice was requested, not silenced. But excitement was quickly shadowed by fear. He had never left the country. He had never even left the East Coast for more than a short trip, and now the world wanted him in Switzerland, standing shoulder to shoulder with professors who had spent their lives building reputations he had been denied. When word of the invitation spread on campus, the reactions were predictable. Strauss scoffed in the faculty lounge. It's absurd. What will he do there? Translate mop water into Italian? Laughter followed her remark, low and cruel. Whitmore was quieter, but no less cutting. In a meeting overheard by a student, he remarked, "The conference committee has made a mistake. They're captivated by a story, not substance. He'll embarrass himself, and by extension us." Yet the students' petition grew larger, signatures doubling. Some even raised money online. to support his travel before the conference organizers had finalized arrangements. To them, Isaiah was not a janitor with a trick. He was proof that brilliance lived everywhere. Still, Harvard sent delegates, Whitmore among them, and they made it clear they would be watching. The flight was long, the first Isaiah had ever taken across the ocean. He stared out the window at endless clouds, repeating phrases in his head the way he always had. French, Italian, Swahili, words to calm himself, words to remind him of who he was. When the plane descended over Geneva, the city sparkled with lakes and mountains. For a moment, Isaiah felt a rush of awe. He thought of his grandmother, her kitchen humming with Creole, her words urging him never to forget the power of his tongue. You belong anywhere words can travel, Isaiah. Yet as he stepped into the conference hall, nerves returned. The grand building was filled with scholars from around the world, name tags gleaming with titles. Doctor, Profess, Ph.D. Isaiah's badge read only, Mr. Isaiah Carter, Harvard University, staff. The word staff sat like a scar across his chest. On the first evening, a reception was held in the grand atrium. Isaiah moved quietly among clusters of academics, sipping wine and exchanging research jargon. Conversations dipped when he passed. Some stared at him curiously. Others smiled with polite condescension. One professor from Germany extended a hand. Ah, you are the janitor, yes. The one with 9 languages. His tone carried the edge of amusement, as though Isaiah were an exhibit instead of an equal. Isaiah shook his hand, but said nothing more than, yes. Another scholar chimed in, chuckling. Fascinating, like a parrot who learned more than one tune. The group laughed softly, and Isaiah excused himself, retreating to the corner. He reminded himself to breathe, to anchor himself in the truth. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here because someone believed his voice mattered. Still, the sting lingered. The next morning, Isaiah's name appeared on the program, Language as Survival, the Silent Bridges We Carry. He stood backstage, the microphone trembling slightly in his hand. Through the curtain he could see the audience, rows of scholars, students, journalists. In the front row sat Harvard's delegation, Whitmore included, their expressions unreadable but fixed firmly on him. A voice announced his name, and the applause was polite, tentative, curious. He walked onto the stage, adjusting the microphone. For a moment the room felt impossibly large. He began softly, in English. My name is Isaiah Carter. For most of my life, people have not seen me. They have walked past me in classrooms, in hallways, in offices. To them I was invisible. I was only the janitor. A murmur ran through the crowd, recognition of the viral article, of the story that had brought him here. Isaiah took a breath and continued. But language has always seen me. When the world told me I was nothing, words reminded me I was alive. Words gave me a way to exist, even when I was told I did not belong. Then, without pause, he switched seamlessly to French, reciting a phrase from his grandmother's kitchen. He moved to Spanish, describing the rhythm of survival, to Italian, where he spoke of beauty and loss, to Swahili, where he spoke of bridges between cultures, to Mandarin, where he reminded them that silence can carry meaning as powerfully as sound. Each transition was fluid, unforced, not a performance but a living truth. His voice carried history, pain and resilience in equal measure. By the time he returned to English, the room had quieted. Language is more than grammar. It is memory. It is wound and healing. It is the bridge between invisibility and recognition. And for those of us who have been dismissed, it is sometimes the only proof we exist. He stepped back, his chest rising and falling. The silence stretched for a long, heavy beat. Then, slowly, the applause came. It grew louder, filling the hall. Some stood. Others clapped politely, unsure. Isaiah nodded once, quietly, then left the stage. But as he stepped into the corridor, the applause still echoing behind him, the sting returned. From the corner of his eye, he saw Harvard's delegation. Whitmore leaned toward Strauss, muttering something with a smirk. She laughed, shaking her head. Their clapping had been perfunctory, their smiles thin and dismissive. Isaiah's heart sank. To them, nothing he said mattered. He was still a novelty, a janitor with a trick. That evening, Isaiah sat in his hotel room, overlooking the lake, staring at the city lights reflecting on the water. His phone buzzed with notifications, messages from students, Strangers, even journalists praising his talk. Moving, powerful, unforgettable. But he could not shake the image of Whitmore's smirk. Strauss's laughter. Their dismissal burned hotter than any applause could soothe. Because applause fades, dismissal lingers. The next morning, as Isaiah walked through the bustling conference hall, two men in dark suits approached him. Their expressions were serious, their steps purposeful. "Mr. Carter?" one asked. Isaiah nodded cautiously. The man held out a badge. "Immigration enforcement. We need to ask you a few questions. Please step with us." Isaiah's stomach dropped. The conference noise faded around him, replaced by the pounding of his own heart. After his speech, immigration officers approached him with disturbing questions. Every day, dignity is tested in ways unseen. Share this video if you believe stories like this matter. The two immigration officers led Isaiah into a quiet corridor, away from the buzz of the conference floor. Their clipped accents and formal tone kept him tense. "We received some unusual notes about your presence here," one officer said, glancing at his clipboard. "You are listed as staff at Harvard University, not faculty." Some delegates questioned whether your credentials warranted a speaking slot. Isaiah's stomach tightened. He recognized the fingerprints of Harvard's delegation all over this. Whispers planted, doubts seeded, authority weaponized. "I was invited," Isaiah said firmly, holding the folded letter he carried with him everywhere. He passed it to the officer, who read carefully, nodded, and handed it back. "That clears you," the officer admitted. "But be cautious, Mr. Carter. Not everyone here wants you on that stage." Isaiah exhaled slowly, the relief thin, fragile. As the officers left, he knew one thing with certainty. Harvard hadn't just dismissed him. They had tried to erase him, even here. The second day of the conference began with chaos. Delegates crowded into the grand atrium for a keynote address. Cameras flashed, translators whispered into headsets, and the hum of dozens of languages filled the air. Isaiah stood near the back, blending into the crowd, when suddenly the room shifted. A loud crash cut through the noise. Gasps followed. A delegate from Senegal, collapsed onto the marble floor. His body convulsed, his face pale with panic. Shouts erupted in multiple languages. "Call a doctor," someone cried in English.
Vite! Vite!
Another shouted in French. "Ambulanza," came from the Italian corner. Doctors rushed forward, kneeling beside the man. But when they tried to speak to him, his eyes darted wildly, uncomprehending. His breathing grew shallow. One doctor turned, frustrated. "He doesn't understand. We need to know what medication he took. What language does he speak?" Voices rose in confusion. No one could answer. And then Isaiah moved. Pushing through the crowd, he knelt beside the man. "Monsieur, pouvez-vous m'entendre?" he asked in French. The man's eyes flickered, but stayed clouded. Isaiah tried again, switching fluidly. "Dax, Dana, Wax Wolof." The man's gaze snapped to him, desperate, terrified. A stream of Wolof spilled from his lips, words Isaiah recognized but had rarely heard spoken so urgently. Isaiah translated quickly to the doctors. "He has a heart condition. He took his medication but thinks he dropped the second dose when he fainted. He's afraid he won't survive another attack." The doctors nodded, understanding at last. "We can work with that. Thank you." Isaiah stayed by the man's side, speaking gently in Wolof, repeating calming phrases while the medical team worked. The delegate's breathing steadied, his panic eased, and within minutes he was stabilized and lifted onto a stretcher. Applause erupted, spontaneous, relieved, heartfelt, not polite, not tentative, genuine. In the midst of chaos, Isaiah had been the bridge no one else could provide. By evening, his name echoed through the conference halls again, not as a novelty, not as a curiosity, but as a man who had saved a life. Delegates approached him with gratitude. Journalists scribbled notes, and even the conference organizers shook his hand with awe. "You were extraordinary," one official told him. "Without you, we might have lost him." Isaiah nodded quietly, humbled. Inside, his chest swelled, not with pride but with validation. His gift, once whispered into empty rooms, had finally proven undeniable. But even as applause surrounded him, Isaiah saw them, Whitmore and Strauss standing together at the edge of the crowd. Their expressions were stone, no smiles, no nods, only the cold glint of anger. Because what the world saw as heroism, Harvard saw as defiance. That night, Isaiah returned to his hotel room, still shaken by the day. He sat at the small desk by the window, overlooking the lake, and let the silence wash over him. He thought of his grandmother again. The way she told him Creole carried survival in its syllables. Your tongue is gold, Isaiah. Don't let anyone steal it. He whispered to himself in Wolof, repeating the words the delegate had said through gasps. You understood me when no one else did. Isaiah closed his eyes, letting the weight of it sink in. For once his gift hadn't just defended his dignity, it had saved another man's life. The following morning, news of the incident spread quickly. Headlines framed Isaiah not only as the janitor who spoke 9 languages, but now as the man who saved a delegate. Clips of applause circulated online, amplifying the story far beyond academic circles. Social media blazed with admiration. He's not a janitor. He's a genius. This man should be teaching, not cleaning. Harvard should be ashamed. But inside the private suites where Harvard's delegation met, the mood was venomous. Strauss slammed her notebook shut. This is intolerable. He's hijacking the narrative again. First the classroom, now the conference. He's turning into a martyr. Whitmore's jaw tightened. We can't attack him directly. Not after this. But make no mistake, the more attention he gets, the more damage it does to us. To Harvard. The institution cannot be seen as secondary to a janitor. The dean's voice joined, cold and final over the phone. We'll deal with Carter when he returns. Make sure he understands his place. This ends now. Isaiah, unaware of the venom brewing, spent his final night in Geneva, reflecting. He had faced doubt, dismissal, even harassment, but he had also been heard, truly heard, in a way he hadn't thought possible. He stood at the window, the city lights glittering like constellations. For the first time, he let himself imagine a life beyond invisibility. Perhaps there was a world where his languages weren't whispers in the dark, but voices that could move hearts, bridge divides, even save lives. And yet, beneath that fragile hope, he knew the storm waiting back home. Harvard's silence was never neutral. Their fury was never accidental. The flight back was quiet. Isaiah sat pressed against the window, the hum of the plane filling the silence. In his mind he replayed the scene in the atrium. The man's desperate eyes, the frantic words in Wolof, the relief when he understood. He had given a gift no one else could. A gift born not from titles, not from privilege, but from years of survival. A gift they could not ignore. And yet as the plane descended toward Boston, Isaiah braced himself. Because he knew Harvard would not meet him with applause. They would meet him with punishment. But Harvard administrators were furious, not proud. Hidden strengths change the world. Share this if you believe in unrecognized brilliance. The applause from Geneva still rang faintly in Isaiah's ears as the plane touched down in Boston. For once he had tasted what it meant to be seen, not as a janitor, not as a trick, but as a voice that mattered. The headlines were still fresh online, his photo shared across timelines with captions calling him a hero. But when he returned to Harvard, the atmosphere told another story. The first thing he noticed was silence. Students who had once whispered his name now looked away quickly when he passed. Professors avoided his eyes altogether. The few nods of recognition that had once slipped through the cracks were gone, replaced by an uneasy stillness, as though everyone had received a warning. By the time he reached the janitorial office, an envelope sat waiting on his bench, his name typed neatly across the front. Inside, a single line. You are under investigation for academic fraud. Report to Dean Harrington's office immediately. The dean's office felt colder than before, its mahogany walls less stately and more suffocating. Harrington sat behind his desk, Whitmore at his side, Strauss in the corner with folded arms. Their faces carried the smug certainty of predators circling prey. Mr. Carter, Harrington began, his voice calm, rehearsed. It has come to our attention that your recent public appearances may have been misrepresented. Isaiah frowned. Misrepresented. Whitmore leaned forward, sliding a folder across the desk. We've received credible reports suggesting you may have exaggerated your abilities. Claims of fluency in 9 languages. Heroics at an international conference. Some are questioning whether these were staged, even fabricated. Isaiah opened the folder. Inside were printed screenshots of the article headlines, photographs of him at Geneva, and comments from anonymous sources casting doubt. One read, I was in his class. He probably memorized lines. He's not a real linguist. Another, it's a publicity stunt. Universities love this kind of story. Strauss smirked. The media loves a sob story. But Harvard cannot allow itself to be humiliated by one. Isaiah's chest tightened. You think I lied? Harrington raised a hand, feigning neutrality. We are not making accusations. We are simply investigating. But if it is found that you misled the public, there will be consequences. You understand the seriousness of this. Isaiah's voice shook, but his words were steady. I didn't mislead anyone. I didn't plant stories. I didn't ask for any of this. I was invited. I spoke. I translated. That's all. Whitmore's eyes were sharp, cold. And yet the narrative paints you as a genius, while painting us as elitist villains. Convenient, isn't it? Isaiah felt the floor tilt beneath him. Geneva had been his brightest moment, the proof of his gift, the validation of years of whispers in empty rooms. And now, Harvard was twisting it into fraud. Word of the investigation spread quickly across campus. Students whispered in dorms, on lawns, in the cafeteria. Some still defended him. He saved that delegate's life. That's real. Yeah, but did he really speak 9 languages? I mean, who even does that? Maybe it was exaggerated. Maybe he played everyone. Rumors swelled faster than truth. The same students who once applauded him now questioned him. Admiration turned into suspicion overnight. Isaiah could feel the shift in the air, the way people looked at him not as a hero, but as someone caught in a lie. His chest ached with each passing glance, each hushed laugh. Late at night, Isaiah sat in his apartment, staring at the stack of books on his table. The languages he had loved, the languages that had saved him, now felt like weapons used against him. He picked up his grandmother's old Creole book. The cover worn, the pages fragile. He whispered the words softly, his voice breaking. They don't believe me, Grandma. They never did. For years, invisibility had been painful. But this, being visible only to be accused, to be mocked as a fraud, cut deeper. It wasn't just dismissal. It was erasure, sharpened into a blade. The next day, Whitmore approached him in the hallway, his voice low and smooth. You see, Isaiah, he said, this is what happens when stories get out of control. You could have avoided all of this if you'd accepted my guidance. Isaiah's jaw clenched. You mean your control? Whitmore's smile was thin. Call it what you like, but without someone like me, you will drown. And once the administration concludes this investigation, you may not even have a job left to protect. The words landed like stones. Whitmore wasn't just an opponent now. He was the architect of Isaiah's downfall, using the very system that had ignored Isaiah for years as his weapon. The investigation deepened. Isaiah was summoned again, this time to answer questions in front of a panel. Professors sat in a row, their eyes cold, their pens scratching notes as though he were a defendant on trial. Can you prove your fluency in 9 languages? One asked sharply. Yes. Isaiah replied, I can speak to you now in any of them. And how do we know you're not repeating rehearsed phrases? Another pressed. I've studied these languages for years, Isaiah insisted. I've lived them. They're not rehearsed. They're part of me. Still, the panelists scribbled doubt into their notebooks. When he left the room, Strauss brushed past him, whispering cruelly, You won't win. They'll never let you. Isaiah kept walking, his fists clenched, his throat burning. But as much as the administration worked to tear him down, not everyone was blind. Some students began circulating their own evidence, recordings from class, clips from Geneva, testimonies of his fluency. A group of international students even wrote a letter to the dean, declaring, Isaiah Carter spoke to us in our native languages when no one else could. His fluency is real. His gift is real. To doubt him is to deny our lived experience. Yet the administration ignored it, labeling the evidence anecdotal. By the 3rd week of the investigation, Isaiah felt his world shrinking. His job was under threat, his reputation dangled by a thread. His dignity, once fragile, now felt like it had been torn apart. And then, on a gray Thursday afternoon, as he prepared to leave after another grueling round of questioning, the unexpected happened. A knock echoed against the janitor's closet door. Isaiah opened it to find a graduate student standing there, her face pale but determined. My name is Rebecca, she said quickly. I work under Professor Whitmore. And I've seen the emails, the ones he sent about you. I know what he's doing. Isaiah's breath caught, his eyes widening. Emails? She nodded. He mocked you, called you a circus trick, told the administration to strip your access. He's been orchestrating this from the start, and I can prove it. The air in the room seemed to shift. For weeks, Isaiah had been cornered, powerless against Harvard's elite. But now, for the first time, someone had stepped forward. Someone willing to shatter the silence. An unexpected witness stepped forward. Would you stand silent or risk everything to speak the truth? Comment your answer. The words from the graduate student hit Isaiah like thunder. I've seen the emails, Rebecca whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. Whitmore wrote them. Strauss responded. They were orchestrating everything. The investigation, the smear campaign, even the doubts about your conference speech. I can prove it. Isaiah stared at her, his heart hammering. For weeks he had been drowning in whispers and accusations, unable to defend himself against the power of Harvard's elite. And now, standing in the dim light of the janitor's closet, someone held out a rope. Why are you telling me this? Isaiah asked, his voice low, cautious. Rebecca swallowed hard. Because I can't watch it anymore. I came here to study language, to learn from people I admired. But all I've seen is arrogance, racism, and cruelty. Whitmore talks about you like you're a stain to scrub away. And Strauss, she laughed when she said you'd be finished soon. Isaiah felt his throat tighten. The betrayal wasn't new, but hearing it so plainly, so nakedly, from someone inside their circle cut deeper. Rebecca pulled a flash drive from her pocket. I copied the emails. I know it's risky, but you deserve the truth. Isaiah reached for it, his hands trembling. You realize what this means for you. If they find out, I know, Rebecca interrupted, her eyes fierce. But silence makes me complicit, and I refuse to be part of this lie. That night, Isaiah sat in his apartment staring at the flash drive, as though it were a ticking clock. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. He opened his laptop, inserted the drive, and watched the files appear. Dozens of emails, each one sharper than the last. Carter must be contained before students rally behind him further. This janitor polyglot narrative is embarrassing. Recommend revoking access immediately. We cannot allow him to dictate Harvard's intellectual standing. Push the fraud investigation. And then Whitmore's words, the ones that burned the deepest. He is a circus trick. That is all. Nothing more than a parrot trained to mimic. If we do not silence him, we risk becoming the punchline. Isaiah's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. Each sentence was another knife, another reminder of the institution's willingness to erase him. Not because he was unworthy, but because he had dared to exist in spaces they believed he didn't belong. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it pressing against him. For the first time in his life, he had proof, but proof alone wouldn't save him. By the next morning, Harvard had already moved. A memo circulated among faculty and staff, carefully worded, dripping with polished authority. In light of ongoing investigations into misrepresentation, staff member Isaiah Carter has been placed under review. We remind all students and faculty to withhold judgment until conclusions are reached. The language was designed to poison the air without saying anything outright. It whispered fraud without spelling it, liar without daring to write the word. Students read it, professors nodded grimly, administrators carried it like gospel, and Isaiah felt the clock begin to tick. Rebecca met him in a cafe off campus, her hood pulled low. She slid into the booth, her hands shaking. They're moving fast, she whispered. I overheard Strauss. They want to finalize a decision within a week. They're afraid the emails will leak. If they fire you before it spreads, they can dismiss it as sour grapes. Isaiah stirred his coffee, his reflection rippling in the dark surface. So they bury me before the truth has a chance to breathe. Rebecca's eyes filled with anger. You can't let them. You have to fight back. Isaiah looked up, weary. Fight them? Rebecca, they have lawyers, money, power. I have a mop and a borrowed suit. You have the truth, she insisted. And sometimes that's enough. Isaiah wanted to believe her. But truth in Harvard's halls had always been fragile, suffocated under the weight of prestige and tradition. Days blurred into one another. Isaiah went to work, pushed his cart, cleaned the same marble floors that now felt like a stage set for his humiliation. Everywhere he walked, whispers followed. Isn't that him? Did you hear? Fraud. They say he faked the conference thing. Some stunt. Every syllable was another wound. And yet he carried the flash drive in his pocket every day, the weight of it both anchor and weapon. By the fourth day, he was summoned again. Harrington's office. The dean's tone was colder this time. Mr. Carter, the investigation is nearly complete. We are leaning toward termination. You may of course resign voluntarily to avoid further embarrassment. Isaiah sat in silence, his jaw tight. Harrington's words weren't advice. They were execution. Whitmore sat across the room, his smirk subtle but unmistakable. Strauss's arms were folded, her eyes sharp. Isaiah rose slowly, his voice calm but edged with steel. You can take my job, but you will not take my dignity. Whitmore chuckled. Dignity doesn't pay the bills, Carter. Isaiah turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. His hands trembled, but his decision was beginning to crystallize. That evening, Isaiah spread the emails across his table, printed now in black and white. He traced the words with his finger, each line a record of the cruelty he had endured. He thought of his grandmother's voice. Don't let them steal your tongue, Isaiah. Don't let them decide your worth. He knew then what he had to do. It terrified him. The thought of standing in court, of being pitted against Harvard's machinery, of being painted as delusional before strangers. But silence had never saved him before, and silence would not save him now. He looked at the flash drive one last time, then slipped it into his pocket. Tomorrow he would go to Dana Wells, the young attorney who had once offered her card after a student rally. He had kept it tucked inside his Bible for months, waiting. Now the time had come. The next morning, Isaiah walked across Cambridge, the cold wind biting his face. He found Dana's office, tucked above a bookstore. She looked up as he entered, her expression curious, then softened when she saw the determination in his eye. I'm ready, Isaiah said, placing the flash drive on her desk. Dana picked it up, her brows furrowing as she scanned the first emails. By the time she reached Whitmore's words, her lips tightened into a thin line. They buried you, she murmured. But now we bury them. Isaiah nodded, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. I want to fight. In court. Let them see the truth in the open. Dana leaned back, her eyes sharp with resolve. Then we file tomorrow. But understand, once this begins, there's no going back. They will try to destroy you, Isaiah. They'll call you delusional, a liar, unstable. Are you ready for that? Isaiah's jaw tightened. They've called me worse my entire life. I'm still here. That night, Isaiah returned to his apartment, the city lights flickering through the blinds. He sat at his kitchen table, his books spread around him like an army. He whispered in each of his 9 languages, one after another, his voice low but steady. French, Italian, Swahili, Mandarin, Creole, Spanish, Russian, German, Wola. Each one a reminder of who he was. Each one a promise that no matter what Harvard threw at him, they could not erase his voice. He closed his eyes, exhaling. The decision was made. The fight was no longer about keeping his job. It was about keeping his dignity, about proving, once and for all, that brilliance did not come stamped with a Harvard seal. He decided to fight back in court. One choice, one heartbeat. That's all it takes to change everything. Comment below if you would have fought back. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a mixture of reverence and tension. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens ready, cameras clicking quietly. Students from Harvard had slipped in too, some in support of Isaiah, others out of curiosity, their whispers filling the air until the bailiff called for silence. Isaiah sat at the defendant's table, hands folded tightly, his uniform replaced by a plain suit borrowed from a friend. It didn't fit perfectly. The shoulders were too broad, the sleeves a little short, but he wore it with quiet dignity. Beside him sat his attorney, a young black woman named Dana Wells, whose eyes carried both fire and steel. Across the aisle, Harvard's lawyers sat in immaculate rows, their expressions sharpened into blades. Behind them, Whitmore and Strauss whispered, their faces smug, as though they had already won. The case was simple in writing, but heavy in implication. Harvard accused Isaiah of fraud, that he had exaggerated his fluency, that he had misled the public, that he had defamed the institution with stories that painted him as oppressed genius and them as elitist villains. But underneath the legal jargon, the real trial was about something larger, whether brilliance could exist outside the boundaries of title and privilege. The opening statements set the tone. Ladies and gentlemen, Harvard's lead attorney began, pacing smoothly before the jury. This case is not about race, or class, or pity. It is about truth. Mr. Carter is not a linguist. He is not a scholar. He is a janitor, a man who, in desperation for recognition, fabricated and exaggerated his abilities. He sought the spotlight and for a brief moment succeeded. But Harvard cannot, and will not, allow falsehoods to tarnish its name. The words landed heavy, slicing Isaiah down to size in front of strangers. Then Dana stood, her voice steady, deliberate. "This case is, in fact, about truth," she said. "But not the kind wrapped in titles or polished in faculty lounges. This case is about a man who has been silenced, mocked, and erased his entire life. A man who, against all odds, taught himself 9 languages. Not for prestige, but for survival. Harvard did not create him. Harvard ignored him. And when the world finally saw his gift, Harvard tried to destroy him. Today we will prove that Isaiah Carter's fluency is real, his dignity is real, and that the lies do not belong to him but to those who fear the truth." Isaiah's chest tightened with gratitude. For once someone was not only speaking for him, but with him. The trial dragged through the morning, with Harvard's lawyers pressing hard. They called witnesses, professors who claimed Isaiah had disrupted classrooms, administrators who painted him as unstable, even staff who repeated whispers about his eccentric habit of talking to himself in hallways. "He's delusional," Strauss testified. Her voice clipped. "He wants to believe he's something he's not. But repeating phrases in different tongues doesn't make you fluent. It makes you a performer." Whitmore was even more calculated. "I admired Mr. Carter's enthusiasm," he said smoothly. "But Harvard is about scholarship. Fluency requires years of structured study, peer review, and publication. Mr. Carter has none of these. His claim to 9 languages is at best an exaggeration, at worst deception." Their words dripped with condescension, each one painting Isaiah as a fraud in the eyes of the jury. Isaiah sat still, his hands clenched under the table, each insult pressing against the years of invisibility he had carried. He wanted to shout, to fight, to tell them they were wrong. But Dana's hand on his arm reminded him, "Wait." When it was their turn, Dana called Isaiah to the stand. He walked slowly, each step heavy with the weight of decades. The oath felt strange on his lips, but he swore to tell the truth. The courtroom leaned in. "Mr. Carter," Dana began softly, "tell us in your own words how you came to speak these languages." Isaiah's voice shook at first, but steadied as he spoke. He told them about his grandmother, Marie, and her Creole lullabies, about being mocked in school, dismissed as slow, and how he turned to language as refuge, about nights in his apartment, surrounded by books no one thought he could read, about whispering words in empty Harvard halls, not to impress but to remind himself he existed. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his story hanging in the air. And then Dana leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, Harvard claims your fluency is fabricated, that you are merely a performer. Would you be willing to demonstrate here and now, under oath, what you know?" Isaiah's heart pounded. This was it. His chance, or his trap. "Yes," he said firmly. Dana nodded. "Let's begin with French." Isaiah turned to the jury, speaking clearly, fluidly. He recited a passage from Victor Hugo, his accent flawless, his tone rich with emotion. Then he translated it back into English without hesitation. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. "Spanish," Dana said. Isaiah shifted seamlessly, describing the colors of the courtroom, the faces of the jury, the weight of the moment, all in Spanish. He then translated into English, word for word. Gasps rose this time.
Italian,
Mandarin, Swahili, Russian. Each time Isaiah delivered not memorized lines but full sentences, explanations, spontaneous descriptions of the courtroom, his story, even fragments of poetry. The jury leaned forward, eyes wide. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. By the time he switched back to English, the room was electric. Whitmore shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Strauss avoided eye contact, her arms crossed. The Harvard attorneys scribbled desperately, their confidence shaken. Dana let the silence linger, then asked softly, "Mr. Carter, are you a fraud?" Isaiah met the jury's eyes, his voice steady. "No. I am a man who refused to stay silent. That's all." The courtroom erupted in whispers, the sound filling every corner. Harvard's lawyers scrambled to recover. They cross-examined, pressing hard, trying to trip him up, recite legal jargon in Mandarin, translate this obscure phrase in Russian, conjugate this irregular verb in Swahili. But Isaiah stayed calm. Some answers were slower, deliberate, but each was precise. Each time they tried to reduce him to spectacle, he turned their test into testimony. The jury saw it. The reporters saw it. Even the judge leaned forward, his expression betraying surprise. By the end of cross-examination, the narrative had shifted. Isaiah was no longer a janitor pretending at genius. He was a man dismantling Harvard's prestige with nothing but his voice. Closing arguments sealed the contrast. Harvard's lawyer warned of chaos if Isaiah's claims were legitimized. If anyone can claim expertise without credentials, what becomes of academia? Dana countered with fire. Expertise without credentials is survival. Mr. Carter's brilliance is not Harvard's to grant or deny. It is his own. And the question you must ask is this: do we punish truth because it did not come in the package we expected? The jury sat silent, absorbing every word. Isaiah returned to his seat, his heart heavy but calm. For once he had not been silenced. He had spoken, not in whispers, not in hallways, but in a courtroom where the truth could no longer be ignored. The judge called for order. The jury prepared to deliberate. The room buzzed with energy, with shock, with uncertainty. And then, after hours of waiting, the judge's gavel struck. Order. The court has reached a verdict. Isaiah's breath caught, his hands tightening against the edge of the table. The words that followed would not only determine his fate, they would shake Harvard itself. The judge's verdict stunned the entire university. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways. What would you have done in Isaiah's shoes? Comment below. The gavel struck the bench, sharp as thunder. All rise, the bailiff commanded. Though the entire courtroom was already holding its breath, Judge Matthews adjusted his glasses, his expression calm but grave. The silence pressed heavy against the wood-paneled walls. Harvard's attorneys sat stiff, their polished suits betraying a sudden sheen of sweat. Whitmore's lips were pressed into a thin line, Strauss glaring holes into the desk. Isaiah sat at the defendant's table, his borrowed suit rumpled, his palms slick against the edge of the chair. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths. Dana, his attorney, leaned slightly toward him, whispering, "This is it." The judge's voice broke the silence. After reviewing the evidence, hearing testimony, and evaluating the credibility of all parties, this court finds in favor of the defendant, Mr. Isaiah Carter. The words fell like a wave. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and students in the back row erupted in muffled cheers before being hushed by the bailiff. Judge Matthews continued, his voice steady. "It is the ruling of this court that Harvard University engaged in discriminatory conduct and deliberate defamation of character. The smear campaign against Mr. Carter was orchestrated with intent to discredit him based on class and race, not merit. This court orders Harvard to pay damages for emotional distress, reinstate Mr. Carter to his position, and issue a public apology." The gavel struck again. Case closed. For a moment, Isaiah didn't move. The words seemed unreal, suspended in the air like a dream he hadn't dared to imagine. Then Dana squeezed his arm. "Isaiah, you won." The room erupted. Reporters shouting questions, students clapping, whispers flooding every corner. Isaiah rose slowly, his knees unsteady, but his back straight. For the first time he stood not as the janitor defending his existence, but as the man who had proved them wrong. Whitmore's face was pale, his carefully curated calm shattered. Strauss muttered something bitter under her breath, grabbing her bag and storming out. The Harvard lawyers gathered their papers, their confidence in tatters. Isaiah turned his gaze toward them, his expression calm, not triumphant. He had no need to gloat. The verdict itself was enough. Outside the courthouse, the world was waiting. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted from every direction. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to win against Harvard? Do you plan to sue for more damages? What's next for you?" Isaiah paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the cold air biting his face, the crowd pressing closer. He raised his voice just enough to carry over the chaos. "I didn't fight Harvard for money. I didn't fight for revenge. I fought because the truth matters. And the truth is this: brilliance does not belong to one color, one class, or one title. It belongs to anyone who dares to survive with dignity." The crowd roared, the sound echoing against the courthouse walls. Isaiah stepped down carefully, Dana by his side, the flash of cameras chasing them into the street. The news spread overnight like wildfire. Janitor wins against Harvard. From custodian to courtroom victor, Isaiah Carter's story. A voice Harvard couldn't silence. His face appeared on television screens, on social media feeds, in magazines and blogs. Hashtags returned, louder this time. Justice for Isaiah. Janitor genius. Truth over titles. Talk shows invited him. Students across the country debated him. Parents told their children his story. For once, Isaiah wasn't the invisible man in the background. He was the headline. On campus, the transformation was immediate. Where once whispers followed him, now applause did. Students stopped him on the lawn to shake his hand, some in tears, thanking him for standing up, for proving that worth wasn't confined to a resume. Petitions circulated demanding he be offered a teaching role in the linguistics department. Flyers appeared with his face. Words like teacher of truth scrawled across them. Professors, some reluctantly, others sincerely, admitted in faculty meetings that Harvard could not ignore him anymore. Even the dean, Harrington, appeared on television. His usual sharp tone softened into corporate apology. We regret the treatment Mr. Carter experienced. Harvard is committed to inclusion and will take steps to ensure this never happens again. But Isaiah knew better. Their apology wasn't born of remorse. It was born of defeat. Still, for once he walked Harvard's halls with his head high. He pushed his cart not as a symbol of servitude, but as a reminder of the path he had walked. The mop in his hand no less powerful than the words he had spoken in court. Students smiled at him openly now. Professors avoided his eyes for different reasons. He was no longer invisible. And yet, the victory was bittersweet. At night, in his apartment, Isaiah sat surrounded by his books, the glow of headlines lighting his phone screen. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. Your tongue is gold. Don't let them steal it. He whispered in his 9 languages, but they sounded different now, heavier, weighted with expectation. The world saw him as a symbol, a hero, even a teacher. But Isaiah felt the cost. He was tired. So very tired. Winning had not erased the years of dismissal, the wounds of being mocked, the nights of invisibility. Winning had not given back the dignity stolen from him. It had simply forced Harvard to admit what he had always known. Dana visited him one evening, carrying takeout and her warm laugh. You realize you're a national figure now, right? She teased. You could run for office tomorrow and win. Isaiah chuckled softly, shaking his head. I'm no politician. I just wanted to be seen. You're more than seen, Dana replied. You're respected. And don't be surprised if Harvard caves to the petitions. They might offer you a teaching role soon. Imagine that, Isaiah. Professor Carter. The words made him pause. He pictured himself at the front of a classroom, chalk in hand instead of a mop. Students listening, not dismissing. A dream that once felt impossible, now dangled within reach. And yet, something inside him hesitated. The offer came faster than expected. A formal letter embossed with Harvard's seal, delivered not to his closet, but to his apartment door. Mr. Carter, in recognition of your extraordinary abilities and recent vindication, Harvard University extends an invitation to join the Department of Linguistics. As a lecturer, we believe your story and skill will inspire future generations of students. Isaiah held the letter in his hands, the words glowing with validation, with recognition, with everything he had been denied for so long. For the first time, Harvard was not erasing him. It was offering him a place at the table. But as he stared at the letter, he felt a strange stillness. Because this was the same institution that had called him a fraud, a circus trick, a parrot. The same halls that had laughed at him, silenced him, nearly destroyed him. Now suddenly, they wanted him. Isaiah walked the halls differently in the days that followed. Students whispered hopefully, waiting for his decision. Some professors bristled, their resentment sharp. Reporters speculated daily. Would Isaiah Carter become Harvard's newest lecturer? Rebecca found him in the library one evening, her eyes wide. You're going to accept, right? You have to. You earned it. Isaiah looked at her, his face unreadable. Maybe. Maybe? She repeated. Isaiah, this is everything you've fought for. Isaiah turned his gaze toward the rows of books, the shelves that had been his secret classroom for years. His voice was quiet, but heavy. Or maybe it isn't. By the end of the week, students gathered on the lawn, chanting his name, waving signs. Let him teach. Journalists camped outside the gates. Harvard administrators huddled in meetings, desperate to spin the narrative. And Isaiah stood at the center of it all. A man who had once been invisible, now the focus of national attention. The letter still sat on his desk. The decision weighed on him like a stone. And when he finally made it, the choice shocked even his most loyal supporters. But Isaiah's final decision shocked even his supporters. If this story made you believe in redemption, Share this video and subscribe to join the movement for change. The letter from Harvard sat on Isaiah's desk for 3 days, its embossed seal catching the light every time he walked past it. Students were rallying outside, journalists were speculating, even Dana had urged him gently. Isaiah, this is historic. They want you. For the first time, they're opening the door. But Isaiah didn't answer. Not yet. At night, he walked the streets of Cambridge, past the gates of the university, past the dorms where students huddled in groups, whispering his name. He walked by the classrooms he had once cleaned in silence, the same halls where professors once brushed past him without a glance. Now those halls buzzed with petitions and promises, but they still felt cold, because Isaiah remembered. He remembered the smirks, the dismissals, the way they called him a fraud. He remembered the years of invisibility, the laughter in the classroom when he first spoke, the whispered circus trick, and he asked himself the question that had haunted him since Geneva. What is respect worth, if it comes only after humiliation? On the 4th day, Isaiah returned to the janitor's closet. His mop leaned against the wall, the bucket still half full of cloudy water. He stood there for a long time staring at the tools that had defined how the world saw him. He picked up the mop, held it in his hands, and whispered quietly in Creole, "You were my silence, but you will not be my future." Then he set it down, walked out, and never looked back. When Harvard announced his appointment offer to the press, people expected a triumphant yes. Students gathered outside the administration building, holding banners that read Professor Carter and Let Him Teach. Journalists were ready with microphones, headlines pre-written. But Isaiah shocked them all. He stood before the crowd, his voice steady, his face calm. "I want to thank those who fought for me, who believed in me when Harvard did not, but I will not accept this offer. My worth does not begin with Harvard's approval, and it does not end with their apology. I will not spend my life teaching in halls that only value brilliance once it survives their cruelty." Gasps rippled through the students. The journalists erupted in questions. "What do you mean? Are you rejecting Harvard permanently? What will you do now?" Isaiah lifted his chin, the afternoon light catching his face. "I will teach, but not here. I will build something for the children who are told they don't belong, for the Asayas still invisible in classrooms. Across this country, my fight was never about standing at Harvard's front of the room. It was about making sure no one else has to fight to be seen at all." The decision stunned the nation. Headlines flipped overnight. Harvard janitor rejects Harvard offer. Carter chooses justice over prestige. From janitor to educator, a school for the overlooked. Some called him foolish for turning down the power and prestige of Harvard. Others called him visionary. But for Isaiah, it wasn't about either. It was about peace. With the damages awarded by the court, Isaiah rented a small building on the edge of Boston. The walls were cracked, the windows old, but when he unlocked the door for the first time, he felt a sense of freedom he had never known. He painted the walls himself, bright colors instead of Harvard's muted stone. He filled the shelves with books collected from donations, each one a story waiting for a child to discover. And on the chalkboard at the front, he wrote in large letters, "Languages are bridges, not barriers." The Isaiah Carter Language School opened its doors to children who had been overlooked, dismissed, or told they weren't smart enough. Kids whose parents cleaned offices, worked double shifts, who never imagined their children might speak French, Italian, or Mandarin. Isaiah sat with them on the floor, taught them words in Spanish through songs, introduced them to French poems, showed them how Creole carried history. He didn't teach for prestige. He taught for survival, for dignity, for joy. Every time a child's face lit up with understanding, he felt more powerful than any courtroom victory, more respected than any Harvard offer. Students who once petitioned for him visited his new school, volunteering their time. Rebecca brought supplies. Dana offered legal help. Even strangers from across the country donated books and resources. The school grew, slowly but steadily, fueled not by prestige but by community. And soon, Isaiah's name carried a different kind of weight. Not the janitor who fought Harvard, not the fraud investigated, not the polyglot hero, but the teacher who gave us a voice. Meanwhile, Harvard's halls carried whispers. Professors walked past Isaiah's old roots, remembering the man they had once dismissed. Students pointed to the janitor's closet, telling first years the story of the man who spoke 9 languages and took Harvard to court. And though Harvard moved on with its policies and prestige, the echo of Isaiah Carter remained, a ghost of justice they could never silence. One evening, Isaiah locked up his school and walked home through the quiet streets. He thought of his grandmother, of her kitchen in Louisiana, the Creole words she poured into him like lifelines. He thought of the mop and bucket he had once pushed through Harvard's marble floor. And he thought of the children who now whispered words in languages the world had told them were too heavy for their tongues. His journey had come full circle, from janitor to educator. Not for Harvard, not for prestige, but for justice. The story of Isaiah Carter spread further than even Harvard's smear campaign ever had. Documentaries were made. His school was profiled on national television. Parents brought their children from across the state just to hear him speak. And yet, Isaiah remained humble. Every morning he unlocked the doors himself. Every evening he wiped the chalk from the board. His life was no longer about being seen by the powerful. It was about making sure no one else was unseen. But in the quiet corners of Harvard, his name was still whispered. Professors mentioned him reluctantly. Students carried his story in their essays. Custodial staff nodded proudly when they passed his old closet. He had left Harvard behind, but Harvard had not left him. Isaiah's choice echoed beyond himself. It echoed in every child who picked up a book in his school, in every parent who believed their child could be more than invisible, in every person who saw his story and dared to ask the hardest question: how many Isaiahs are we still ignoring? The halls of Harvard still whisper his name. But the question remains: how many more Isaiahs are we still ignoring? Stories like Isaiah's happen every day, but most are buried in silence. If you believe every voice deserves to be heard, type yes for justice, and subscribe if this broke your heart.